In a time long past and filled with wonder, there was a small town plagued by hunger. All the fields had long lain fallow, no hope at all, their wells too shallow. And all the poorhouses and shops had no need for levers or locks, as they had nothing of worth inside, nothing for robbers or thieves to find. But the house on the hill was different from the rest. It was tall and grand and clearly the best. But though the hill wore the house like a crown, those inside weren't welcome in the town. They were greedy, the townsfolk could tell, but inside the house not all was well. What once was a grand and sparkling place, full of smiles, hope and grace, was now a place of quiet despair. Loss and sorrow filled the air. The parents of a boy called Nick had grown weary and very sick, and soon young Nick was all alone, and his house no longer felt like home. Long ago his laughter had filled the halls. Now silence echoed between the walls. He was so very sad and stayed all alone, so his servers that tended to the home brought him lots of gifts and toys, but none of these brought him any joy. For months and months nothing changed. Then years and years things stayed the same. Then one day he found a note. Underneath letters he wrote. It said, "Once there was a very rich man, the richest man in all the land. He lived his life without a care, mean to all who lived there. But here too there was another, who looked just like the rich man's brother. But they were different as night and day, for this man was poor, but made his way, being kind to all he found. He was the gentlest man around. And though he begged for scraps of bread, and had no home to lay his head, he would always do a good deed, and helped all those who were in need. And upon the day when this man died, all who knew him wept and cried. On angels' wings he went to heaven, and was greeted by all those who'd met him. Soon the rich man met the same fate, but he was barred at heaven's gate, for he had not helped those in need, and instead led a life of greed. So who was the rich man, and who was the poor, if the rich man was barred from heaven's door? Putting the book back on the shelf, Nick sat on his bed and thought to himself, "Aren't I just like the rich man in the story? I have to change things to show I'm sorry. Although I'm sad, it's plain to see the rich man in the story is just like me. I have so much and I'm so sad. It's no wonder people think I'm bad." In the morning light he left the hill and went into the town while all was still. Looking from the drains to the steeples, he saw so many poor, hopeless people. They were ragged and tattered, wretched and sick. They needed help, and they needed it quick. All of a sudden he felt a tug on his sleeve that made him stop before he could leave. A little boy begged without words, his need clear, though he couldn't be heard. Nick didn't know what to do. He had to help, that's all he knew. Though rich, his pockets were bare, so he took off his coat without a care, and gave his hat and scarf too, and thought to himself, "What else can I do?" To the next person he gave his rings. Nick clearly didn't need all of these things. His necklace of gold he gave away too, to a poor old woman with just one shoe. He knew his boots would be too large, but he gave them to her without charge. Then, when he could give nothing more, and the people were a little less poor, he went back home up the hill. It was the middle of the night, all was still. Then Nick noticed something strange. His feelings inside began to change. Sadness gone without a trace, and a slow smile began to light his face. Back at home, Nicholas found his staff and spoke to them with a laugh. He was smiling, and they stood in shock while he stood there in just his socks. It had been so long since they'd been asked for anything, and now they had work at last. They set to the task and made him a cloak, red as hollyberries with a sack black as smoke. Nick was as happy as could be. His new cloak smelled like pine trees. He put it on and it fit like a glove, so warm and soft and made with love. He took his sack and filled it with food, clothes and toys that could lift anyone's mood. Then he left his house that very night and went back into the town by moonlight. He looked for the people he'd met before, but found others who needed his help more. The next morning, he'd made up his mind. It was time to leave his old life behind. He would give away all of his things and only keep his grandfather's rings. The last two things he would take on his way was a silver bell his parents had on display, and the story that had made all of this begin, to remind him to find the kindness within. An old grey donkey was last but not least. His father had loved it, but it was a grumpy old beast. Once all else had been given away, Nick knew it was time to be on his way. On went his boots and his big red cloak, and took his sack that was black as smoke. He left the town where he'd grown so wise, and his journey took him far and wide. He met people, both rich and poor, and looked deep inside to their core. He saw who they were inside, their deepest secrets could not hide. But for those that wanted only good, he gave them everything he could. For years he went from place to place, then would swiftly leave without a trace. The only thing he'd leave behind were gifts and food for people to find. And even though he left no name, the townsfolk knew him just the same. Tons of gifts before their eyes. It was Saint Nick, they'd shout in surprise. They'd tell stories and spread their cheer, and they'd welcome him back every year. Many years later, he went back home to the town where as a boy he'd grown, laden with gifts for each girl and boy, bringing every household such joy. Soon all knew the name of the man who had brought such wonder to the land. And though many presents may come to you, to this day St. Nick's message rings true. It's clear now for all to see that nothing good comes from greed. Instead, help others and you will find happiness comes from being kind. Have you been good this year? Will Saint Nick bring you something for Christmas? I hope you enjoyed this story, and perhaps you're already snoring. Good night.